I want to make a little video for you today that kind of summarizes some of the collars that are out there that would be great training options for you. It's a question I'm asked often, and I realize that there are different viewpoints from different trainers. And I'm not here to argue about any of those. I'm just simply here to show you what some of these options are and how they might work best for you. So I'm going to do my best to just summarize. I'm not really going to get into how to use them at this point. I will try to make another video regarding that soon. So let me zoom in on my table here so I can help you see what I've got. Hopefully this will give you a good view. I'll try to move over here. Okay. I'm often asked if a harness is a good option for training your dog. I would say not for training your dog. Harnesses are meant for pulling. That makes it more comfortable for your dog to pull. Are there circumstances where a harness would be a good option? Absolutely. Like if you have a dog that has a collapsing trachea or some other neck injury that prevents him from being able to use a regular collar, well, you may have to use a harness. So knowing what harness options out there can be a great thing. Like, for example, this is called a no-pull harness. It's probably different than some of the ones that you've seen before because this one is designed, if I can, got a lot of hair in it from years and years ago. This one is designed to pull tighter underneath the arms when the dog pulls. So that puts pressure under the arms instead of on the chest or the neck. It is helpful. It will not stop pulling, but it can help reduce the pulling. And the other thing it's really good for is a small dog. Like I've sold some of these to wiener dog owners because their legs are so short they tend to squirm out of harnesses sometimes, so they do make a smaller version, and that can be helpful because then when the dog pulls, of course it tightens and he can't squirm out of it. Another type of harness which I actually have not used is the kind that you can hook in the front, so it hooks at the chest level so you're pulling sideways when the dog pulls, and that can be helpful. I've heard of people finding those to be useful. So if you're in a situation where you have to use a harness, that might be a good option for you, or something like this, so that you can kind of get more control even though you aren't able to use the most control, which is really going to come from around the neck. I think there was one other point I wanted to make about that, but it's gone. Anyway, the other thought I had is halties. People ask about those. Those are the ones that go around the nose, and I don't have one of those, but they go around the nose of the dog, and you control the head with that halty. It kind of looks like a muzzle that you would put on the dog. And so I have heard people get some good results from those as well, but you do have to be cautious because particularly in a really overly stimulating situation, the dog could get injured because it is connected to their face, and if they were to jump up and down and that sort of thing and spin around, you're actually putting an awful lot of tension on their head, which could damage their neck. I can tell you from experience with that. I had a really tough dog some years ago that I tried it on, and he would throw himself straight up in the air and land on his side and just go wild when I put that on him. So you certainly have to train them properly with that. It takes a little bit of conditioning for it, but it may not be the perfect answer to all situations, and ultimately it would be nicer to just use a standard collar if you're able to do that. So I'm not going to cover the halty, and I'm really not going to cover any more with the harnesses, but I just wanted to give you an awareness that those things are out there, and there may be certainly a circumstance where those things can be useful or helpful to you. I'm going to probably start from the top here. So if I were looking at the most control that you can possibly get, maybe I know people who refer to it as power steering for dogs, we're going to look at the prong collar. A lot of times people see this and they go, oh, that looks really mean, and they're afraid to use it. And if you're afraid to use it, you're not going to use it right, because if you don't use it properly, you end up just desensitizing your dog. This is true of any tool. I don't care what kind of collar you use. If you don't use it properly, you can either hurt your dog or desensitize your dog. And by desensitize, I mean pretty much make them so that the neck isn't sensitive to your leading, and you have to pull that much harder to control them. So The prong collar can be very, very useful if you have a strong dog that you are having a difficulty controlling who has already learned a bad habit. So if your dog is already a puller, maybe you adopted him and he has just no leash manners whatsoever and he gets so overstimulated in public that you can't even get his attention, prong collars are great for that. The prong collar is not going to impale your dog. If you've ever seen any videos about that, very rarely you will, but if you look on the internet, you can always find a misuse of a tool. And you'll find things where people sharpened these. Well, that's a misuse of the tool. So these are not sharp. You can put rubber covers on them, but then you're just kind of minimizing their efficiency or their usefulness. So the prong collar, the difficulty that you can have with it is putting it on and off. If you have troubles with your hands, the prong collar does need to be assembled each time you put it on. You don't slip it over their head, you put it around their neck, and you have to connect it by pushing the prongs together like that. And so that's something to be aware of in case you do have troubles with your hands. There are some other options, like this quick release here. This one has a nylon version, so this would go over your dog's head. You would slide it over the dog's head, and then you would tighten or adjust the nylon portion. The downside is it's not going to release as quickly as a chain is going to. The chain's going to be real quick. Okay? Versus that's a little bit slower, so it may not be quite as sharp of a correction, quite as precise, but it still is a great option if you have troubles putting it on and off, and it still can be a useful collar. There is another quick release. I don't have an example of those, but that one, this part you have to disassemble and kind of fish a piece through and put it on every single time. I'm not fond of them because I think they're cumbersome, and I more often than not see people using them when they're not assembled correctly, and they can be very dangerous. I had a dog that was actually had some aggressive tendencies come in, and the lady had it on wrong, and it could have just popped off at any second. So being aware of that is important, that you got to use it properly. You got to make sure it's put on right. And one thing, not to go into great detail on this, but one thing to notice on these, I never take them apart down here, because if you take them apart near the end, things can get goofed around without taking it and showing you. It can be really awkward, and you're thinking, how does it go back together? So I always do it in the middle, or somewhere not at the very edge. And there are different sizes, okay? And you can put more links in or take links out as well. So one other note I would say on the prong collar, well, I'll say a few things about it. First of all, like I said, if your dog is a strong puller, it can be really helpful to use something like this. It gives you lots of control. It also allows you to use the least amount of pressure when you do want to control your dog. You can use the tiniest amount to get their attention oftentimes. Some dogs are harder. They have more extra skin, that sort of thing, and they might need it to be a little bit sharper. But it is a great tool for trying to reduce the amount of pressure you need, even though it seems counterintuitive. It seems like this would be a lot more. It gives a nice, even, steady pressure, and it can't over tighten. It can only go this far, depending on how, oops, let me get you down on the camera. Only go this far, depending on how many links you have in there. It can only tighten to a certain degree. So it's really to get their attention, to kind of give them a little pinch to get their attention. I would encourage you, put it on your legs, see what it feels like when you tighten it, and that'll give you a good idea of what it's going to feel like on them. These, I have seen them pop off. The links can get weak, or a little stretched out, or maybe it's not put on right. In fact, a vet didn't put mine on right in Green Bay, and I had a loose puppy in a very busy area. So I like to have a backup with these. One option is to just get something like this. You have a loop at one end. Can you see that? A loop at one end and a clip at the other. So I would put my dog's standard collar on him at the same time as I have this one up above. Hook this one onto the standard collar. Put my prong collar on above it. The collar in use should be closest to the head. And then I would attach my leash to both of these, and then that way, if for some reason the prong collar fell off, I still have my dog. But I found in recent times an easier solution and a nicer one is to just get an oversized nylon slip lead. So I get it too big for the dog, so it's got extra. I really don't want it to do anything unless the other collar falls off. And then I slip that one on first, and then I slip my prong collar on, and I connect my lead to both of them. That way if the prong collar pops off, I still have my dog on the leash. And that's just a helpful way to keep them. I mean, there's other slip leads you can use. I wouldn't use a chain one because the prongs can get stuck through it. But that allows you to have the least amount of stuff on their neck. It can get kind of cumbersome when you have two collars on them. So it's kind of handy to just have one. So anyway, back to just the purpose of these is if you need a lot of control and if your dog is a strong puller, it allows you to start to teach them to respond to lighter pressure. But again, it's got to be used correctly. It also gives a self-correcting effect. So if your dog is just way ahead of you and you stopped and just held still, they're going to actually correct themselves. That's true of any collar, but this one's a little bit nicer because it gives them that quick little pinch, that on-off pinch. Downside, it looks menacing. It needs a backup collar if you're really going to use it the safest way. It has a stigma about it. People think it looks mean, and so that's a downside, but it's just such a great tool for many people, particularly if they're unable to control their dogs, or if they're maybe not that big of a person. Maybe their dog just gets overly excited in certain circumstances, and you're just working through all these scenarios, but you can't control them all. So let me just give you an example as I'm babbling on. When I walk my two dogs, they weigh more than I do together. And one of them has some dog aggression issues. If a dog were to come loose at us, for example, we would be in trouble. So I walk them with prong collars on because that gives me the most control for the safety of them and for me. However, one day, it had been years since I had seen loose dogs on my walk, so I used their lighter training collars because they were walking very nicely, and you can't control what happens around you, and I couldn't control the loose dog that came at us, and that made it extremely difficult for me because it put them into a kind of a more frenzied state, and of course I got nervous because my dog is dog aggressive, so that went down the leash to the dog as well. If I had stayed calm, maybe things would have went better, but in any case, it made it really hard to control because they are large dogs, and I don't get the level of control with those than I get with these. I was using slip chains, and so and a martingale on one of them. And also the other thing is, and I'll get to this next, is the slip chain got out of position then when the dog spun around, and then he was getting choked. So it's just an ugly thing. So if you have large dogs and you're going to be in a situation where there's going to be circumstances you cannot control, you can't beat really a prong collar if it's used properly, so that you know no matter what comes your way, you can manage it if the dog is bigger and stronger than you. So that's my view on the prong collar. So then if I were to go down from there, what would be the next level of control? So let's say I train my dog on a prong collar, or I don't need to even start with a prong collar. My next level of control would be a slip lead. Now I'll move these over. I actually hated slip leads. I just started using slip leads within the last year because I've seen people misuse them so often, and you see these dogs going down the aisles just because they can't breathe, because they're being choked, because it's not being used properly. Again, any tool used incorrectly is going to not only be ineffective, but it's also dangerous to your dog, and these definitely would be in that category because they don't stop tightening, whereas the prong collar can only tighten this much. You still have this hole. This collar, a slip lead, can go and, oops, I gotta get my arm down here, sorry, can keep tightening and doesn't loosen up if it gets out of position. It will loosen up if it's in the proper position, but again, that's all about using it properly, which I'll talk to you about more in another video. But the key is, whichever side you're on, it needs to be coming off the top like this. The easiest way is if you walk your dog on your left, it should look like the letter P. Keep getting out of the video, sorry. and then you put it over the dog's head while it looks like a P. That way, if it tightens, it loosens right back up. But if you were to go on this side, see how it locks? It doesn't loosen up there. So you'd have to do it the opposite way, like the number 9, if you walk your dog on the right. So it's coming off of the top there. You can see it, and it loosens up instead of coming around from the bottom. So there are different types of slip leads. There are chain ones. There are nylon ones. And this one is, it's not leather, but it's a synthetic sort of leather, so that gives you, I don't think it's leather. Maybe it is. Anyway, you can get them in leather or synthetic leather. So there are different ones. Notice there's no sound with this one. Obviously no sound with this. This one gives a sound, which can make it a more effective as well, a more effective tool. So used properly, it's a great tool. It makes it, the noise a lot of times will get their attention, and so that you can teach your dog to respond almost more to the noise than anything if you're using it properly. So it can feel like almost there's nothing on their neck as well. So if they're used to pulling, it can be a really handy tool because you can keep it nice and loose. There are different views, by the way, as to how these should fit. And in the other video, I'll probably talk about that more when I show you how to use them. But a nice way to use this one, honestly, is to use it as if there's nothing on the neck. You'd want it a little extra big so that it just sits there and hangs nice and loose. And that way, that a dog who's maybe a strong puller and has gotten really used to pulling, you can really show them the difference between this and this. They need to know that difference. They need that neck sensitivity. You need to practice leash pressure, and you can't really do that if you have a solid feel around their neck at all times. So it can also be great for a dog who is either working toward off-lead work so that he gets used to not really feeling anything on his neck, and that might be a hunting type dog, or if you live in a community where it's legal. I would recommend that you do not let your dogs off leash in areas that it's not legal, and also for the safety of people who are walking by, as I know I'm very sensitive to that, considering I have a dog who has leash aggression tendencies. If I have a dog come after me, I'm stuck. I'm on leash, we're doing the proper thing, and then a dog comes out and I can't control that other animal. It can also be useful for a dog that maybe is off lead around the house and you have to go into town. I've had a student in class, the dog just was getting real creeped out when we were putting a collar on him and trying to work with him with heel work. And when we put this on him, he changed, and he was doing real well with that because he was always off leash at home. He wasn't used to feeling anything around his neck. So this is a great tool for a dog who really doesn't have much leash training and needs to understand how to respond to that leash pressure without feeling real insecure because all of a sudden he's being drug around by the collar. So, particularly for a dog who's maybe mighty soft, a dog that responds for just to the slightest pressure, that might be a better choice for him. They're also quite inexpensive, and they're easy to carry along and put on and off. I would say you do need to check these. I noticed these are welded on every link. I had one break off the other day. The ring opened up and my dog was loose. I didn't expect that, and then I looked at mine. Mine was a much older chain, and it didn't appear that they had been welded. So make sure you have a high quality chain to start with, but then also do inspect it every now and then. I don't use a backup collar with this one, but I have learned now I better inspect them. So what are the cons of this one? They're often misused. People they let the dog pull. They don't control it. It's not an on-off pressure to them. It should be a on-off pressure, just real quick. But instead, they end up doing this and letting the dog just drag them down the aisle and choke. And that's not only unhealthy, but incorrect. And you're just teaching the dog to pull. They require frequent repositioning too. That can be kind of difficult. If it gets over here and you're walking on this side, it might slip underneath here because they step over it. So you have to, sorry about the angle, you have to reposition it often. That means you're going to have to be able to bend down and kind of put it back up where you want it so that it sits nicely. And so that can be difficulty if that's maybe if you have physical limitations of your own, or just because of just an inconvenience overall. It does take a little bit more, excuse me, it's a little bit more difficult to learn, so it takes a little bit more skill to use it properly, because you want to make sure your pressures are on off. You got to be quick. You got to develop that muscle and that quick control so that it's just a snap on off to get their attention, and then it goes loose again. And it really can't be worn very well with another collar, so that's another downside in terms of identification, because I think once you attach ID to it, it can get kind of tangled, a little bit cumbersome, but it's possible. Just a side note on these, it's not a good idea to use either of these, the prong collar or the slip chain, as a tie out. You'd never want to leave this on the dog when they're unattended. And that's probably true of the next one I'm going to talk about. Other than a flat collar, you really shouldn't. These are training collars. They're not intended to be used for tie out or for just everyday use, or even when you're driving. I'm a little hesitant, because what if you had an accident and the dog got loose and he needs to be, he's running around and he gets caught up on something. So I tend to be worried about things like that. So these are really training tools, and they all work about the same. And so that would be the next level of control. So most control is going to come from the prong collar. Then the second level would be the slip chain. And then this, the Martingale is a hybrid between a flat collar and a slip chain. So you can see that it's got the flat collar look, and you can get creative designs with that. And then it's got a chain. Again, it can tighten only so tight, so you can set it up so that it slips over the head. And then you can set it up so that it can only go so tight, but you want it to be where it's going to be definitely a tight, snug fit, overly tight when it's popped like that. But it's a little extra loose when they're not pulling. And you want to make sure that you're keeping it like that so that it's just an on-off pressure. The nice thing about this is you don't have to, this is going to be on the top when you're walking, so it should release pretty quickly. Okay, they do make it with a nylon as well, a nylon string here, so it doesn't make the noise like that. I don't think those release as quickly, so that's a downside of them, and they're quiet, but there may be a reason that you would want something like that too, and that's an option. That's also a good option if your only reason is that you have a dog who slips the collar. Some dogs have those bigger necks and little heads, and they can slip a collar when they back up, but this will tighten up so that they can't slip it. And if you have it adjusted right. Same with a slip chain. That can be a really good tool for those types of dogs. Okay, so the pros on this is you can display their ID properly and easily. It improves the leash pressure differentiation over just a flat collar, so it does help with that. And it's good for very young, softer dogs, or those that are already trained, so that you can, as you're transitioning downwards. So if you have a young puppy, you might want to use something like this in your training. It's also good for a dog that's just really sensitive and would be maybe almost traumatized by anything more than this. Some dogs are real soft, as I'll say. And also as you're moving downward in your training. So if you started with a prong collar and then your dog really responded and started to understand leash pressure and things were going really well, and then you went down to a slip chain, and then they got really good at that in lots of different scenarios, and they always were receptive to your leading, even on that, no matter where you are, then you might want to move down to this and then eventually to a flat collar. So that'd be kind of the direction that you could go. So the downside of this would just be that it may not be enough leash pressure effect for a dog that has learned to pull already. So it may or may not. And then again, you got to use it properly. If you don't do quick on-off pressure, they won't understand that differentiation, and they'll just learn that, hey, it just feels like this to go for a walk, we always pull. And then finally is just your typical flat collar. Flat collars are great for everyday use, for displaying your identification, for providing a secure connection if you're tying them out. You can get really stylish, fun ones. Some of them, I will warn you, some of the nylon ones that are really slippery will loosen up. So, and that can be true of the martingales as well, so be aware of that. And then the cons is just that it's may not be enough, may not give enough distinction in leash pressure if your dog has a tendency toward pulling, or even just during the training phase. They might not be able to tell the difference as much between the two. So if I had a young puppy that I'm not ready to train to heel yet, I might want to use a harness initially, because that way we're not developing any bad habits. Because most of us, that at least most of the students that I have already, whether they're puppies or not, started to develop bad habits on the leash. Their dogs are pulling, and that's when you end up needing the more, maybe the more aggressive tools, if you will. I don't know if the word aggressive is what I'm looking for, but the more control as you're teaching them. But if you start out with just using a harness when you take them potty and different things when they're really young, that can be helpful, so that when you actually do start working with leash pressure, you know what you're doing and your dog gets the full effect of it right from the beginning. And that can help you avoid a lot of problems. Because when you're reteaching, that can be the most difficult. And so that's where you have to choose what tool is going to be best for you based on what your circumstance is. Do you have maybe a health factor that affects you, and so you can't control your dog without a certain tool? Or does your dog have a health issue that affects which tool you can use with the dog? But all of them will only be as effective as you use them. And finally, I'll just make a quick note on leashes. I see so often, and I was guilty of that years and years ago, using slippery leashes. And you'll find, especially if you have a powerful dog, that slippery leashes really make a difference in how effective you can lead them on the leash, how much you can communicate with them, because your corrections, when you do make them, are just, your hand tends to slip on the leash and you don't even always notice it. So it minimizes what you're trying to do. And so making sure that you have a leash that actually feels like, you know, when you pull on it, your hand doesn't slip, so that you have a good grip of it. This is a leather version. This is a rubber version. There are other ones that are nylon but have rubber grips on them, or maybe you could make your own type of grip. But just make sure that you feel like you can really grip that leash, so that the sensitivity is on both ends. You want it to be sensitive with in your hand and down to the collar, so that your dog really understands you're leading with the least amount of pressure. And you can get tiny amounts of pressure with a prong collar, just the tiniest, ever so slight, and your dog responds. You can get that with a slip chain. You can get it with a martingale, and eventually, with many, you can get it with a flat collar. But it all takes practice, learning to lead your dog and communicate down that leash.